Thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Colin Quinn. I'm the Deputy Director for External Relations here at CSIS. I know that our Senior Vice President, Andrew Schwartz, would have loved to provide the introduction. However, he's under the weather and therefore had to bow out. I must mention, as part of our safety procedures here, that you can find your exits the way you came in. So if there's any trouble at all, you can make your way out safely that way. It's tradition at CSIS to always provide a warm welcome for our speakers, and I'm humbled to have that opportunity. As one of the leading historians in America today, Jay Winik has been called upon by presidents, senators, and Supreme Court justices for his unique insight and extensive knowledge. He is perhaps best known for the New York Times #1 bestseller, 1865, where he weaved the experiences of Grant, Lee, and Lincoln to tell the story of the closing stages of the American Civil War. And in today's world, where current events demand we look to the past for solutions and guidance, I'm reminded by one of my fellow Irishmen, Edmund Burke, who famously said that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Well, Jay can be credited with bringing history to life and to a wider audience. All his books have been bestsellers, including this one, which debuted at number 9 on the New York Times bestseller chart. Jay, we are honored to have you with us. And before handing over, I return to Edmund Burke, who also said, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. As we discuss the pivotal year of 1944 and the decisions facing the great leaders of that era, those words echoed then and they echo through to today. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jay Winik.
All right, thank you for that introduction. I cannot promise to have an accent like that. It added a touch of class. It was pretty cool. Just give me a second here to open up this bottle of water. Okay. Oops. Might as well do this. Okay, but thank you all for coming, and thank you for CSIS for hosting this. This is a marvelous institution, and I always tell people, I say, I'm in Washington, but I am very definitely not a policy wonk. But one has to appreciate what those who help us make policy and guide us in policy or become stewards in making policy do. And so I'm thrilled to depart from my normal book speaking schedule and come to a place like this. So thank you very much. All right, so let me get to the book now as to why we're here to 1944. 1944. It was not inevitable that the war would end as it did or even end well at all. Indeed, along the Western line, the Allies were pinned down by the Nazis in Italy along their withering fire on the Gustav Line. And in the East, the Soviets were still making murmurs about forging a separate peace with the Nazis. So as we enter into 1944, war and humanity remain very much in doubt. And what would commence would be one of the most epic years of the war and indeed of the 20th century. But against this backdrop, I want you to consider a remarkable meeting, if you will, that would take place upon the two heads of the Western Alliance, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill. Consider these two men just for a second, if you will. Churchill, whose voice growled, Churchill with a cigar hanging from his mouth, Churchill, whose legendary oratory kept the Western countries in the fight, even as one country after another fell one by one to the Nazis. Churchill, who refused to give up or give in. And then there was his partner FDR. FDR, of course, was a cripple who would get elected president not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times. FDR, who was crippled by polio, but would overcome it. A legendary charmer who, when America was in its darkest days, through his legendary oratory, would uplift the hearts of Americans in their most dire of times. And these two men would meet in Cairo as they would talk about what was to happen next in this war, how to bring this terrible, bloody war to an end, how to bring a carnage to a stop. And as they were in Cairo, for a moment they took a few moments off. Churchill burst into the villa where FDR was, and he said, "Mr. President, you must come with me. I've arranged for us to see the pyramids and to see the Sphinx. It's very exciting." And Roosevelt was so captivated by Churchill's excitement that he tried to push himself up with his hands and his knuckles whitened, and he realized he couldn't stand. This was a rare lapse on his part. But soon thereafter, they motored out as the sun was setting, as certainly dawn had ended, and the sun was kind of closing down in a curtain, and they looked at the pyramids. And then after they looked at the pyramids, they went over and they looked at the Sphinx. And they looked at the Sphinx from all the different angles. And at one point, Churchill said in his plummy voice, he said, "I wonder what she has to say." And then he looked over to Roosevelt and he said, "My God, I love that man." And yet, what did Roosevelt say? Well, normally this wittiest of conversationalists, normally this most loquacious of men, he looked over to Churchill and he said nothing. As it turns out, he was as inscrutable as the Sphinx, and this would become significant as we move on to the story of what would take place in 1944. And soon they would leave Cairo and they would go en route to Tehran. And then in Tehran, they would meet for the first time with the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. And they would decide what would happen next in the war, what would be the tactics they would employ, what would be the strategy they would employ to finally bring the Nazis to an end. And when Roosevelt first met with Stalin, interestingly enough, Stalin walked in and Roosevelt looked at him and he thought, "My God, he's a very small man considering how much power he has." And he looked at his teeth, which were pitted from too much smoking, and he felt here was a man with great carrying power. And interestingly enough, for his part, Stalin, when he looked at Roosevelt, he looked at his face and then his gaze filtered down where he looked at the shriveled legs of Roosevelt. Because like the rest of the world, or most of the rest of the world, it didn't occur to him what a cripple Roosevelt was. But then soon thereafter, they got down to business. They got down to talking about the two most significant decisions they had to make. The first decision was who would command the Western forces for D-Day. And the second decision would be that there would indeed be a D-Day, a true opening of the Second Front, something to relieve the pressure from the Soviets as they were fighting and dying in the snowy wastes against the Nazis. And as they were going back and forth to discuss the details and the tactics and all the different elements, at one point there was a pause. Roosevelt stopped. Great beads of sweat came down his forehead. And all of a sudden he was seized by this terrible agonizing pain. And he couldn't speak. They whisked him off to a back room where he was inspected while he was looked at by his personal physician. And a personal physician decided it was nothing more, he said, than gas. And he decided he could go on. But this, as it turns out, was a grim omen of things to come because there really were great things amiss with Roosevelt's health. But nonetheless, after haggling for days, they eventually came to a decision. D-Day would commence on June 6th. That would be the fateful day to open up the true Second Front. And they thought they would choose Marshall to be the commander of the forces, but it turned out in a bait and switch, Roosevelt would choose, of all people, Dwight Eisenhower. And then with that, comfortable with the thought that the war would about to come to an end, that all was going well with the war, Roosevelt returned home. And when he returned home, he went to Hyde Park, and Christmas time came. And as Christmas time came, he engaged in what was a ritualistic reading of Dickens to his family. And everybody was making merry, they were drinking eggnog, they were having a good time. But it turned out, once again, Roosevelt was sick, very sick. He had a fever that wouldn't quit. He had a hacking cough that wouldn't stop. He could barely stand. And in fact, as it turned out, when he went back to the White House and he was in the Oval Office, the Secret Service would be stunned several times to go into the Oval Office, and they would see that Roosevelt was sprawled on the ground. He had fallen out of his chair. And they were equally stunned that as he would get his correspondence and he would try to sign it, that he couldn't even put his signature on the correspondence. All he could do was scrawl a simple line. He had this cough again that wouldn't go away. He had the hacking cough that wouldn't stop. And he had chills that wouldn't quit. And in fact, this normally most stoic of men, this most stoic of presidents, when asked by others, "How do you feel?" he would say, "Well, I feel rotten. I feel like hell." And he did feel like hell. He was a very sick man. In fact, his family was so concerned that they sent him to Bethesda Naval, where he had a complete workup by a new doctor, a Dr. Bruin. And Dr. Bruin said, you have congestive heart failure, along with a number of other maladies. And if you don't do something, if you don't get rest, you will be dead within a year. And those words would be prophetic. But nonetheless, even as that, things would be marching on, time would be marching on, and history would be marching on. Now, I want to remind you of one thing about Roosevelt's health. Why was it so significant? Well, it was significant because the two most important events of the war would take place. The first was, of course, was military, the impending invasion of D-Day. And the second event that was so important and so crucial was not military, it was not political, it was not diplomatic, it was moral. It was the impending gassing of some 750,000 up to 1 million Hungarian Jews at a place called Auschwitz, tucked away in the barren wastes in a dark forest in Poland. Now, wrap yourself, if you can, around that figure of 750,000 for a second, if you can. 750,000. Well, it turns out that the population of Boston at the time was 325,000. So it was as if you took the entire population of Boston, doubled it. Every man, every woman, every grandfather, every grandmother, every child, and put them on a train, no, not a train, but really sealed boxcars, and took them from Boston, and they went on a 3 or 4 day voyage to Washington, D.C., and then as they would disembark, everyone would be murdered in cold blood. But as for Roosevelt himself, what his mind was on at this point was he had to take a rest. He went down to stay at his friend Bernard Baruch's estate in South Carolina, and he was supposed to be there for 2 weeks. He was so sick, he would stay there not for 2 weeks, but for a month. And as he went down there, he said, my God, I want to sleep 12 hours a day and sleep and sleep and sleep. And for the most part, that's what he did. But as it turns out, the war continued without him, and things were going well in the war. The Allies would seize the critical Air Force bases at Foggia, which would give them total mastery of the skies. And more than that, they would seize Rome, the capital of one of the Axis powers of Italy, and with that, the war seemed to be going well. And everything seemed to be going right for the Allies. And with the start of June, the greatest armada in the history of mankind was beginning. 5,000 ships were getting ready to sail. Some 180,000 men were getting ready to board those 5,000 ships, which would begin sailing on the choppy waters of the Atlantic. And in 1,000 wide-bellied aircraft and fighter pilots, which would totally blacken out the skies. And this would be a military caravan, literally, without parallel. And if Normandy succeeded, it would be the greatest day, not only of the war, the greatest day not only of FDR's presidency, but one of the greatest days in all of modern history. But as it turned out, from the outset, D-Day seemed in peril. Why did it seem to be imperiled? It seemed to be imperiled because of the weather. Great storm clouds were whipped up. Great winds were whipped up. Visibility was poor. The downpour was so impossible that at one point Eisenhower said, it seems to be almost inconceivable that we could carry out an invasion in such weather like this. And as this torrential rain was falling, Eisenhower met in Southwick House with his top aides, with his top brass, to talk about what to do next. And he said, how long can we leave this invasion hanging out on a limb? And they thought not much longer. But again, it was impossible that they could commence the invasion in this kind of weather. So what Eisenhower did is he said, let's have a pause. Let's reconvene in about 8 hours and then see how the weather is doing. They reconvened again. The weather was still no good. One more time, Eisenhower said, let's take a break, let's take a pause. As the wind was rattling the windows of Southwick House, as the rain was coming down in torrents, he said, let's meet one more time. So Eisenhower went back to his command headquarters. He lay down on his cot. He took a little nap. And then when he woke up, he shaved. He spent a few minutes looking through some dime store novels because he was trying to relieve the anxiety. And then he drove back to his command headquarters where he met with his top aides. And this time, when he met with the meteorologist said, we have a break. There's going to be a 36-hour break in the weather, and that will provide our small window. If there were to be invasion, it would have to be then. So Eisenhower put his chin to his chest, paced around the room, put his chin to his chest again, paced around the room some more, sat down on a couch, and there was nothing but silence for 5 minutes. And then at this point, he then stood up and he polled his aides about what to do next. 6 were for the invasion, 6 were against. Once more, he sat down and he paused. And then this time he said, "Okay, let's go. We will go." And with that, the cheers began filling the room, and it was clear that the invasion was going to begin. D-Day was about to commence. And as D-Day was about to commence, see it if you can for a second from the German side, from the Nazi side. There's the great Erwin Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, who was in command of the German forces at the Atlantic Wall, a wall that was designed to last for 1,000 years. And he said to his staff, he said, "This war will be won or lost on the beaches." And then faithfully, he said, "It will be the longest day." And that longest day would happen this way. It would begin with a German in his bunker looking out at the sea. And he would see the choppy waters being whipped up. And then all of a sudden, he would see a ship, then another ship, then another ship, then tens of ships, then hundreds of ships, and then thousands of ships. And then he would see nothing but blackness. The ships would be blacking out the entire sky. And soon this invasion would commence with a ferocity almost never seen before in the history of warfare. And the guns would open up their shelling, and it was as if the heavens had opened up their primordial wrath. And on 4 key beaches, the invasion went well. They had virtually no opposition. They rolled up the Germans in literally matters of hours. But on a place called Omaha Beach, the Germans fought with great tenacity and great ferocity. And the casualties for the Western Allies, were for the Americans really, were terrible. Men were floating down face first in the waters. Arms were bleeding into the beach. Heads were blown off. And it seemed almost impossible. One by one, the commanders of the American forces were being shot and killed. And at one point, Omar Bradley, from one of his ships, looked out and he said, "Oh my God, this is a crisis of irreversible proportions." So what would happen next on Omaha Beach? Well, what would happen next is at one point, a lieutenant would scream out at the top of his lungs. He would say, "Men, we may as well get killed inland on the hard ground as we do on the beach or in the waters." And at that point, in a triumph of ingenuity and a triumph of courage, the men would begin improvising. And soon thereafter, they would capture the high ground. And after they captured the high ground, they would capture Omaha Beach. And it was clear that D-Day had succeeded spectacularly. And it was also clear that with the success of D-Day, Germany's fate was sealed, and it was not a matter of whether the Allies would win the war, but when they would win the war. And it would clearly be sooner rather than later. So, at this point, a call was put into the White House. Roosevelt was sleeping. He awoke at 3 p.m., and he put on, actually I should say 3 a.m., he put on a light sweater, a cardigan, and he was on the phone with Marshall, and he said, yes, I understand. And what Marshall told him was, the light of battle is in our men's eyes. And the light of battle was in their eyes. The tide had turned. But I want to remind you of one thing. Even as the empire of war, the German Third Reich's empire of war was crumbling day by day now and hour by hour. One thing was not crumbling, and that was the empire of death, as symbolized by a place called Auschwitz in Poland. I want to remind you for a second just Auschwitz was. Auschwitz was a place where Jews were gathered up, often in the greatest of secrecy, and they were herded on the cattle cars where they would undertake a 4-day journey, and you would have the elderly. You would have men, you would have women, you would have children. And they would be riding wedged like sardines into these boxcars, and they would have no food. They would have no water. They would have no sanitation. They would have virtually no air. And on this trip, many died, literally standing up as they would make their way to Auschwitz. And at one point, a train pulled into Auschwitz station. And when the Nazis opened up these boxcars, they found 4,000 children. They were all dead. And why were they dead? They had suffocated because there was no air in the cars. But anyway, when these trains would come into Auschwitz, typically what would be seen by these Jews as they would haplessly stumble out of the cars, it would see these great flames shooting into the skies. They were the flames of the crematoria, like nothing humanity had ever witnessed before. And then they would also smell something, a smell that was ghastly, a smell that was horrid, a smell that was odious, again like nothing they'd ever smelled before. This was the smell of broiling flesh. And at one point, a little girl said, "Daddy, will there be playgrounds here like they are back home?" And the fathers, not knowing what would happen next, would shake their heads. And another little girl who understood a little bit more than the first little girl said, "Of what use is there a God when his only duty is to punish?" And what would happen is they would stumble out onto these ramps, and there would be dogs barking. There would be men screaming at the top of their lungs in languages they often didn't understand. And they'd be saying, "Rouse, rouse, rouse, out, out, out." And then doctors would make their way. Yes, doctors. And doctors would look at these stumbling crowds of Jews and go, "You to the right, you to the left. You to the right, you to the left. You to the right, you to the left." If you went to the right, you were a slave laborer, and you were worked to death, usually within a matter of months, and more often than not, within a matter of weeks. If you went to the left, you were usually a woman, or a grandfather, or a grandmother, or a child, because for the Germans, it was always about the children, always about the next generation. And if you were one of these, you were sent to the gas chambers. And when you went to the gas chambers, you would have no idea what you were going to embark upon. You were told to take off your clothes. You were told to hang up towels. You were given a bar of soap. And at one point, somebody might say to one of the Germans, saying, "I want to be with my child." And they would say, "Yes, together afterwards." Or, "I want to be with my parents." "Yes, together afterwards." They would go down into these cold and forbidding rooms, and on the walls would be the faintest of scratches. They couldn't figure out just what these scratches meant. And then the lights would flick on, the lights would flick off. They were cold, they were freezing, and they would be screaming. The Germans were tormenting them. The SS was mocking them. This would go on often maybe for an hour, and then all of a sudden, after about an hour, there would be a clink. And from the clink, there would be gas. It would come not down from the ceiling below, but it would start from the ground up, and then it would rise. And then with that, the screaming would begin. The screaming would be ferocious. It would be at the top of their lungs. But after a few minutes, the screaming would become nothing more than a death rattle. And then the death rattle would become nothing more than a squeak. And after 20 minutes, that squeak would become nothing. It would be all nothingness. They would all be dead. And after about an hour, the Germans would repeat that all over again. So the question was, this was the question. If the empire of war was crumbling, if we were doing so well with the war, if FDR knew that the war was now going to be won in just a matter of time, would he do something about the empire of death? Well, it turned out there were two men, two very brave men, who wanted to do something about the empire of death themselves. They were inmates at Auschwitz. One man's name was Rudolf Verba. The other man's name was Alfred Wetzler. And they had resolved that they would escape from Auschwitz and tell the world what was going to happen next, the gassing of up to 1 million Hungarian Jews, the greatest death at one point in the history of mankind. So they had an audacious plan. They had resolved that they would hide out in a woodpile. And in this woodpile, they had determined if they could stay there for 3 days. It turned out that the German policy at Auschwitz was then the search would be turned over to the SS at large and the Gestapo at large. And then if Verba decided, if we can just stay in this woodpile, we can then perhaps make it. So when nobody else was looking, they jumped into the woodpile, and then they covered themselves up with petrol, with Russian petrol. And they did this because they were trying to foil the scent of the dogs that would come looking for them. And they waited. They waited pensively. It was dark and it was cold. 5:30 came, no sirens. 5:45 came, again no sirens. 6 o'clock, again no noise, no screaming, no shouts, no barking dog, no sirens. They thought maybe, just maybe we're in the clear. But as 6:15 rolled around, all of a sudden they heard the loud wails of the sirens, and they heard some 3,000 men, 3,000 German soldiers pounding their way through every part of Auschwitz, every part of the camp. They heard dogs, Doberman pinchers and German shepherds barking at the top of their lungs. And they heard screams and shouts and swearing. And they waited, and they waited. But they were okay after the first night, and they were okay after the second night. Now the second night, they heard these ghastly sounds, clink, clank, clink, clank, clink, clank, and they wondered what were those sounds. Well, it turned out those sounds were the ovens of Auschwitz working overtime, and they had never heard those sounds quite in that way. And then the third night, they were still okay, and yet they heard another sound. But this sound was not eerie, it was not scary, it was actually exhilarating. They heard the sounds of airplanes flying above, and they heard the sounds of bombing being taken place, and they thought, maybe they found us. Maybe the Allies have come. Maybe the Americans have come. And maybe they're bombing this terrible, nefarious camp after all. But they weren't bombing the camp. They were bombing industrial targets some 4 or 5 miles away. But nonetheless, after these 3 days and 3 nights, they eventually realized they were safe. They pushed the top of their woodpile open, and they climbed out above. And they both stumbled onto the ground, and they turned around, and they saw Auschwitz, as so many other people who perished at Auschwitz saw it. They saw these flames in the sky. And then they turned around, and they ran as hard as their exhausted and enervated bodies could take them, and they never looked back. And what would commence from there would be this harrowing 17-day journey in which they would elude Nazi patrols, the SS, they would elude the Gestapo, they would elude anti-Semites, and they would eventually make their way to Slovakia. And once in Slovakia, they would tell the tale of Auschwitz in all its bitter detail about what was occurring there. So the word would be brought to the Allies, and the word would be brought to FDR, what was occurring there. And the memo would be typed up in short form. It would make its way to the White House within 3 days, and then unfortunately it would take several months before the full memo, the 30-page memo, would make its way to Washington. But in all its details, for the most part, Washington would know what was taking place. So the question is what would happen next? What would happen when Roosevelt got wind of all of this? I want to remind you for a second about Roosevelt, the commander-in-chief, if you will. Roosevelt was probably the greatest commander-in-chief this nation had ever seen, except for Abraham Lincoln, but he was right up there with Abraham Lincoln. It was Roosevelt's fertile imagination that came up with the arsenal of democracy. It was out of the fertile imagination of Roosevelt that came the policy of Lend-Lease that would keep the British alive and the Soviets alive in their time of great need. It was out of Roosevelt's fertile imagination that would come these fireside chats that in their direst of times of needs would uplift the hearts of Americans. It was out of Roosevelt's fertile imagination that would come the North Africa campaign, a campaign, I would say, that most of the aides to Roosevelt thought was so ill-fated that Eisenhower said this would be the blackest day in American history. But it turned out it was Roosevelt who was right and not Eisenhower. And the North Africa campaign would give invaluable seasoning to the American GIs, and it would also boost the morale of the soldiers in their time of need. And it was out of the fertile imagination of Roosevelt that he would become the towering figure in the summit. Nothing seemed to escape the fertile imagination of Roosevelt except for one thing, and that was the Holocaust taking place in Auschwitz in Poland. And here we have this paradox. We have Roosevelt, the world's foremost humanitarian, confronted with the world's defining moral tragedy, the greatest humanitarian crisis the world had ever seen, and somehow Roosevelt flinched. And the question was why? Well, why was this? We don't totally know, but we know that since 1942, as information came out in bits and drabs and then in a torrent, Washington repeatedly did nothing. In fact, at one point, it turns out there was a German industrialist. He was determined to start what Rudolf Verba at Auschwitz, when he escaped, was determined to finish. It turned out that this Eduard Schulte, this industrialist who was highly placed in the German regime and who despised the Nazis, he was determined to blow the whistle on what was taking place with the final solution. And putting his life in jeopardy, he engaged in a series of clandestine meetings, and he went to Switzerland and he told them what was occurring. And from there, the information went into Washington, telling them, do something about what Schulte called were these giant cemeteries. But nothing happened. And nothing happened in part because at the State Department, at that point, tinged with anti-Semitism, and was headed in its visa division by a man named Breckinridge Long. And Breckinridge Long, as Jews all throughout Europe, crammed the consulates, desperate to get to freedom, desperate to come to the shores of America, desperate to find a way out of Europe, desperate to escape the gas chambers and the shootings. As he was doing that, it turned out that Breckinridge Long, the head of the visa department, wrote a notorious memo in which he sent it out to all the consulates, and he said, by various means and administrative devices, we can postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of visas to the Jews. And by doing so, he led them off to a certain death sentence. And it turns out there were some 200,000 slots that were never used, that were just waiting to be seized, each one by a man or a woman or a child or a grandparent. But nothing ever happened. So the question is what would happen next again? Well, this went on for long enough, and eventually Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, one of the closest allies politically to Roosevelt, one of his best friends. It turns out they had a weekly lunch every day on Mondays. And Morgenthau was just so stunned and so sickened and so appalled by the bureaucratic foot dragging, by the reluctance to do something, by the reluctance to help the Jews, by the failure to come to grips and grasp this terrible moral tragedy, that he decided to take matters in his own hands. His department wrote a memo that has to be one of the most hard-hitting memos in all of American history, surely one of the most explosive memos. This memo, in 18 pages, it was headlined the following: the government's acquiescence in the murder of the Jews. And it was sent to all people, if you can imagine, to Franklin Roosevelt. Well, when Roosevelt got this, it was like a lightning bolt from out of the sky, and he immediately called for, within a day, a meeting with Morgenthau. They met in the second floor Oval Office in the study there, and Roosevelt was still unwell. He was still coughing, not feeling right, but he said, what do you want me to do? And they decided to set up something called the War Refugee Board, the sole purpose of which was to help the Jews in need. But of course, the question humanitarians asked was it too little, too late? And in too many cases, in fact, millions of cases, it was too little, it was too late. But around this time came another very profound debate. And this debate was prompted by humanitarians, and they raised a question of why not bomb the rails going into Auschwitz? Or more significantly, why not even bomb Auschwitz itself? And the question is, should they do that? Well, it turns out that the point man for this was one of the legendary wise men, John J. McCloy, in the War Department. And as it turns out, McCloy was the point man who had interned the Japanese earlier in the war. And what McCloy said was the following. He said, we can't do this because it will be an unnecessary diversion of resources. But in fact, as it happened, it turns out that planes and bombers had been flying over and above and around Auschwitz for some months now, as part of the oil war designed to degrade the industrial targets. And then more than that, Churchill had gotten wind of all this, and his response was immediate and impassioned. He said, my God, this is one of the greatest crimes ever committed in all of humanity, and let's bomb these camps and get everything you can out of my name and do it. So Churchill had an immediate yes. But McCloy had also a no. McCloy said one other thing. If we bomb the camps, it may provoke greater vindictiveness on the part of the Germans. And you have to ask yourself, what could be more vindictive than the gassing of little children in gas chambers at Auschwitz? And it turned out there were two more things taking place. The first was the Polish Home Army. They rose up against their German masters in Warsaw, and they fought hard, and they fought tenaciously, and with everything they could. And Churchill was desperate to help them. And not only Churchill, but Roosevelt was desperate to help them as well. He cared for two reasons. One was political, because he wanted the Polish vote in 1944. But he also cared because he wanted to give a signal to the world that America stood shoulder to shoulder with the Poles in their time of need. And so he sent 194 planes, which would airlift guns and material and all sorts of other devices that would help them out. And he did this knowing full well that nonetheless the Poles were going to be butchered. But again, he wanted to make that symbol, that signal to the world. We stand with the Poles in their time of need. And yet, as they said that, humanitarians said, if we can stand with the Poles, why don't we stand with the Jews in their time of need? And then one other thing took place around this time. There was a daring raid and a rescue at Amiens prison in France, where they fleed a number of fighter pilots. And they did this where they bombed one part of the camp, the other part of the prison, And what took place was this kind of exhilarating rescue. And we actually had pictures of it. And in these pictures, we saw the following. We saw Germans face down, bleeding into the snow. And then we saw other men running into the forest where they made their way to freedom. So the question was, in light of all this, would we bomb Auschwitz? And the answer was a resounding no. Well, actually, that's not entirely right, because it turns out we did bomb Auschwitz at one point, but we bombed it by mistake. And what was the response when we bombed it by mistake? Well, the Germans didn't even try to mount their anti-aircraft weapons, but they scurried into the shelters. And then the Jews, these poor Jews, these Jews who were so thin they barely looked like human beings. They looked like the Walking Dead. These Jews who had no hair because it had all fallen out. These Jews whose eyes looked like sockets. These Jews who couldn't stand, so they sat, or they crouched in the ground. But somehow they found their way to their feet and they cheered. And as the great Nobel Prize laureate, Elie Wiesel, who was in the camp as a young boy, said, "We do not fear death, not that kind of death." So did we bomb Auschwitz? The answer was no. But anyway, the war would soon come to an end. And as the war would soon come to an end in April, Franklin Roosevelt, his health ailing, running on fumes, barely able to keep himself alive, eventually he gave out and he died as well. And then within shortly after that, Hitler would commit suicide in his bunker. And when Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, weirdly, almost oddly, he would do it at virtually the same time of day as Roosevelt would die at Warm Springs. And then the unconditional surrender would take place, and the war would come to an end. And when the war came to an end, eventually the Americans liberated a small camp. This small camp was not an Auschwitz, it was not a Bergen-Belsen, it was not a Treblinka, it was nothing like that. But when they saw the carnage taking place there, when they saw the bodies stacked like cordwood, when they saw this General Patton, who had seen virtually everything, vomited, and then Eisenhower said faithfully and significantly, he said, "Finally, the GI now knows what he's been fighting for." And then at war's end anyway, whether you were in London or you were in Paris or you were in Ankara or you were in Washington or you were in Los Angeles, you were screaming at the top of your lungs, "Long live the great Americans. Long live the great Franklin Roosevelt." This was one of the fruits of 1944, defeating one of the most monstrous regimes in the history of the world, defeating the Third Reich. But there is one other fruit of 1944 I want to remind you about for a second. And I call this the missed emancipation moment of Franklin Roosevelt. Remember for a second, if you can, what happened in the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, the war was started over geography, over Union at the outset. But eventually, as the war crept on and with the triumph of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln then promulgated the Emancipation Proclamation. And he turned the war from a war about geography, a war about union, into a war about humanity, a war about liberation, a war about freedom. And the question was, would FDR do the same as the evidence trickled in increasingly in a torrent as we got into 1944? And he would not. So there are two things about 1944 I want to remind you about. The first fruit is the triumph of 1944. It's of great decisions made. It's of heroic leadership. It's of the wisdom of our leaders and of Roosevelt. It's of the heroism of our men. It's of the defeating of the Third Reich. But then there's another poisonous fruit of 1944. This other fruit of 1944 is of the voices of thousands of people, of children, of men, of women, of grandparents. It was the voices not of thousands, but of tens of thousands, and really of millions. It was of the voices of people we could have helped, and somehow we never found it within our hearts or within our policies. That's the other fruit of 1944. So it's a tale of exhilaration, but it's also a tale of untold sadness. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, with FDR's declining health, do you believe any of his specific decisions were impaired?
I think his reluctance and his inability to do something about the Jews was impaired.
If he was healthy, he would have done something.
I don't know that he would have done something, but I do know that he was so sick, he was dying, and when people saw him in meetings, at one point Churchill Churchill and his own personal physician looked at Roosevelt and they said, "My God, that's a dying man there. He will be dead within a matter of months." And he was dead within a matter of months. And even his own staff members would look at him. His collar was way too big. His hand shook violently. His voice was raspy. And usually, his voice had such great carrying power. And he just seemed to be a weakened, ailing man. But what he cared most about, Roosevelt, were two things: bringing the war to a close, and with D-Day, that was clear that was going to happen. And then the other thing he cared about, or the two other things I guess he cared about, was being reelected the fourth time. Of course, he broke the precedent set by Washington by running for a third presidency. And then the other thing he cared about was his post-war vision, the United Nations. And again, I want to bring you back to this paradox, this thing that history has no definitive answers. All we have are the tragic results. That this man who was the foremost humanitarian on the world stage somehow never seemed to grasp, not only in his head, he knew all the facts, he knew them as much as anyone, but in his heart, he never had that visceral, automatic, immediate reaction that Churchill had, where he said, "My God, this is the most monstrous crime. We have to do something." And I really do believe, though we'll never know for certain, that his health had something to do with it. Yes, sir.
Can you say a word about Vice President Henry Wallace? And I believe the Democratic Convention in 1944 was in July. If Roosevelt had died before that, say in the spring of 1944, maybe you don't want to speculate, but can you just talk a little bit about how things might have been different? Because Wallace, later on has a kind of a different approach than Truman did to the Soviet Union.
Well, it's a what-if question, and it's a very interesting question. Did you all hear it? It's what if Roosevelt had died and Wallace had become president? Well, firstly, I should say I'm careful about these what-if questions, though it does turn out that I travel around the country and everyone's got a Wallace question. I'm not sure what it is. One thing I want to say about Roosevelt is, and I think this is important, as sick as Roosevelt was, here was a man falling out of his chair in the Oval Office. He couldn't scroll his own signature. His jaw was slack. His eyes were glassy. He was a dying man. And why did he continue to feel it was so necessary he run the wartime effort? Well, for one thing, he didn't trust Wallace. And then the other thing is I'm convinced that, here we are in one of the halls of CSIS. All great men have a certain vanity about them. And I'm convinced that Roosevelt thought he was immortal and he would live forever. I can't say what would have happened under Wallace, though I think the Cold War clearly would have taken a different turn as opposed to if Truman becoming president. But I think for the story of 1944, that remains, it depends on when it would have happened. I guess I want to say that. Yes, sir.
There's some commentary, subject to lots of correction, that the Democratic establishment essentially overcalled Roosevelt and more or less forced Truman on Roosevelt, more or less knowing what you've just said about Roosevelt's health. People who were close knew he was at grave risk of not surviving at his term, if not a month.
Right.
So they got rid of Wallace and put in Truman, who was later mocked as the newcomer, but I don't think he was a newcomer.
Yeah. Well, I can say two things about that. The first is this is my first talk where I've had two Wallace questions. And the second is you did such a good job, I think you answered it. I think it's safe to say that they were worried about Wallace. Truman was not somebody who was really seen as the likely candidate at first to be president. And in fact, Truman himself, when they really put the screws to him, and then even Roosevelt put the screws to him, and when he got off of that phone call, two things struck him in the back of his mind. The first was just the carrying power of Roosevelt's voice when he really wanted to say something significant. But more significantly, Truman turned several shades of white. And they walked out, and there were all sorts of photographers and Secret Service people, and Truman's wife looked over to him and said, "Is this what we're going to endure for the rest of our time?" And it was. I want to get somebody in the back if I can. Yes, sir. You.
Yeah, I got to press you on sort of the question you posed, though. And the
Yeah.
question is, why
That's why I'm here.
Why would the greatest humanitarian not do what obviously Winston Churchill grasped immediately? The gentleman over there posed the health thing. He said that might be part of it. So why? Was it a matter of priorities? There were other priorities that we have to do. We have to keep the Russians in the war. We have to work on that one. Is it Roosevelt's an anti-Semite somehow? Is Roosevelt overwhelmed by certain of his advisors? Though he certainly seemed, to my mind, in my read, to be, certainly the head of the organization without a doubt. So what's the answer to the question why?
Well, let me take because it's an important thing that has to be addressed is, did any of it have to do with anti-Semitism? And I recently gave a talk where somebody said this in a way that I didn't quite expect. And she looked at me and she said, "Why do you think he wasn't an anti-Semite?" But what I say to that is, I don't believe there was an ounce of anti-Semitism in his body. To be sure, he grew up in a milieu, this kind of cloistered, wealthy milieu of rich bon vivants. And Jews were not part of their social circles. Indeed, at one point, Eleanor went to a party at Bernard Baruch's, and she later wrote a letter, and she said, "God, that Jew party at Baruch's was appalling. I don't ever want to go back to that." But I would say by World War II, whatever taint or lingering element of sentiments were with them, I think they had clearly shed. At one point, Roosevelt said, he said in a press conference, he said, "In the past, my relatives may have been Christian, they may have been Catholic, they may have been Jewish. What matters is that they had a belief in a higher creator." And I think he was saying clearly, I'm not an anti-Semite at all. And he had plenty of Jews in his cabinet, and of course he had Henry Morgenthau in his cabinet. Morgenthau, who put all at risk in that fateful meeting with him in the White House. So the question is what else? The thing about Roosevelt is you have another paradox with him. He was a ruthless and in many ways cold, bloodless leader. And what he said repeatedly was the quickest way to help the Jews was to win the war as fast as possible. But of course the right post to that, as the Nation put it at the time, was yes, if there are any Jews left. And what I want to tell you about this story is not to have helped out the Jews in 1940 may be understandable. In 1941, it may be understandable. In 1942, still yet even understandable. Our options militarily were limited. Though I would say it's very different, and when one looks at what's happening with immigrants today, it becomes haunting in terms of its echoes when you consider that there were 200,000 unused visa slots. He didn't have to go get the permission of Congress. All he had to do was say yes, and he never said yes. He was worried always about a fifth column. That was preposterous to think of a fifth column of Jews. But by 1944, and this is where the story is more complicated and more nuanced, in the point that I'm trying to make, that is when militarily we knew what the story looked like, what the picture looked like. And that is when the need was greatest because of the gassing of the Hungarian Jews. And that was at the time when we should have done something, we could have done something, and when it was most needed, and we didn't. And there we just see a hardening of the heart, and the difference between Roosevelt and Churchill is pronounced. Yes, sir.
Well, you didn't tell who actually liberated the Auschwitz camp, and that I think the Russians did that.
Yeah.
And the second is, probably this question has to be more to a political scientist than historian, but maybe you can answer it. Don't you think that we now have a repeat of the same story?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Don't you think we have now a repeat of the story of World War II, that we need an alliance with Russia to defeat the terrorism?
All right, that's a tough question, and I guess what I'll say is yes, it was the Russians that liberated Auschwitz, and it's pretty haunting, the footage that they took, but they weren't quite moved as emotionally, say, as Churchill was, or many Americans, or as Eisenhower was. And of course, that has to do large measure with the kind of regime they had, and the fact that Stalin was the head of that regime. In terms of the other question, I think I should leave it to the political scientists, because I'll only stumble en route. Yes, sir.
Hello, and I should disclose that I am from Poland, so maybe a little correction. Auschwitz was liberated by the Soviets, and of course...
as opposed to the Russians. Yeah, that was a slip of the tongue.
I mean, Soviets, I mean, yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, also Russians, but
Right.
we know the Soviets was a very multinational...
In Kansas City or Los Angeles, I don't get this kind of a follow-up.
All right, yeah. No, but this is,
I mean, you guys are tough customers.
Well, FDR was such a towering and consequential figure that many European nations also have their perspective on him, and Poland certainly belongs to one
Right.
of them. But the defining moment from the Polish perspective came a year later, and it was February 1945, and the conference in Yalta.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not a very positive perspective, and not necessarily because of what was agreed at the Yalta conference, but what really happened later. I mean, the lack of implementation and it's hard to blame FDR for this, but at least in
You mean
our
what happened with Poland in terms
right,
of
yeah, and and with the whole
basically seating Poland, but in promise for elections that never happened.
correct. I mean, elections and all those things, and of course it was beyond. During the Cold War, it was beyond American kind of influence. But at least, I mean, in our perspective, this is what stuck in our mind. Would you comment a little bit about his relationship with Stalin?
About what?
His relationship with Stalin.
About Roosevelt's.
Yes,
Yeah,
and then
okay.
whether he saw Stalin as a Bolshevik revolutionary or in a rather kind of traditional Soviet or Russian kind of imperial figure. Thank you.
No, it's a great question, and the question is for me to give a comment on the relationship between Stalin and Roosevelt, and I love this question because the thing about Roosevelt is I'm convinced thought he was immortal, and I'm also convinced he thought he was invincible. That Roosevelt was a legendary charmer. I mean, here is a man who tamed the Depression in its darkest days, even when America seemed to be in the throes of a revolution. And most Americans forget that. But time should not dim just how serious the crisis was when the Great Depression happened. So he had tamed the Depression. He held Hitler at bay. He got elected president 4 times. Nothing seemed to be beyond his ability, his reach, his imagination. And he was convinced when he met with Stalin, and as he put it, he didn't call Stalin Stalin, and he couldn't wait to do this. He eventually would call him at Yalta Uncle Joe. And he thought he could just work his magic. In the book, I talk about how Roosevelt thought he could work his Prospero-like magic, his Shakespearean-type magic on him. And it turned out that Stalin was a very tough customer. And if you really parse it, and I didn't do a systematic analysis of this, that would be for a political scientist more than a historian or a historian of just the relationship of the various summits. But I would say that Stalin got his way a little bit more than Roosevelt did. Now, what Roosevelt did do was he held Stalin had been chomping at the bit to get the Americans in the fight for the Second Front from very early on. And what Churchill saw and what Roosevelt agreed to, much to his credit and much to his wisdom, was that the American army was not ready for the fight. We had this pitiful force that was something like 17th in the world, and we needed to train our men. We needed to gear up the arsenal of democracy. We needed some battle seasoning. And that's why when we had our North Africa campaign, Eisenhower wanted that fight to be in D-Day. They wanted the Normandy invasion. They wanted one great and grand tank battle across the rolling plains of Europe. And Churchill said no, because he saw nothing but misery and death. And again, Roosevelt agreed with him. So they did hold off the invasion. They held that off to 1944 until it was ready. But then it's very interesting as they discussed the shape of the post-war world, and they sat around the table. Roosevelt realized he's getting nowhere with Stalin. Stalin is totally unmoved by his genius, by his wisdom, by his charm, by his jokes. And then he decided to employ a trick. And he went to Churchill that morning before they met, And he said, Winston, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to do something. And he didn't spell out exactly what that something was, but when they sat around the tables with all the aides, he began to tease Churchill mercilessly. This was Churchill, his best friend, Churchill, who when no one else was willing to fight the Germans, Churchill was willing to put everything and say, we'll fight on the beaches, we'll fight on the sand, we'll fight in the skies. And he made fun of him and teased him mercilessly. And Churchill was actually quite hurt. And it was only when he did that that somehow a smile came on Stalin's face. And at that, they broke a little bit of ground. So there you have their relationship. Yes, sir.
Not to let Roosevelt off the hook for 1944, but it's my understanding, and I don't have any specific sources for this, but the Navy war in the Pacific in '44 was not going that well. And I've read some historians who said it's very possible that it could have been turned around where the U.S. would have been in trouble in 1944 in the Pacific. Is there any thought that you have that really there was another focus there, that he had to fight the war in the Pacific and it just was overwhelming?
No, I don't believe that for a minute. I mean, by then America was a great power that could walk and chew gum at the same time. They could carry out multiple operations. The tide was really turning. And what I'm not talking about is a D-Day style invasion of Auschwitz. I'm talking about something that would have been akin to what we did to reprovision the Polish Home Army, or even when we bombed Auschwitz by mistake, to send a striking symbol to the world that this kind of barbarism, the final solution, will not stand. And we can look at one other thing as well, which was, of course, we had made stunning progress in the creation of the atom bomb. So we had that in our arsenal. That was rapidly coming to our arsenal as well. So I mean, it's an important question, but it just doesn't, in my view, hold as much muster. Yes, sir. And I'll get you after. You, sir. No, you got a mic coming.
Thanks.
You may have a better voice than I do.
Well,
so
that's
you don't need a mic.
First of all, thanks a lot, Mr. Winik, for joining us tonight. There's a lot of study about how the ground commanders reacted, probably most notably Rick Atkinson in Guns at Last Light. But what was Roosevelt's response to Malmedy? To the Malmedy massacre?
To the what?
The Malmedy massacre. Well, that's the first question. Probably the easier one would be all through 1944. De Gaulle went and pretty much told anyone who would listen that he had an interest in retaining Indochina. FDR said no. As far as April 45, he dies. De Gaulle goes to Truman, and Truman says sure. So what was FDR's perspective on French keeping Indochina? Thanks.
Well, the French question is a very complicated, complex question, and de Gaulle gave Churchill and Roosevelt no end fits. I mean, they just found him almost insufferable. And on the question of empire, what you see is that you see Roosevelt was ardently against the fruits of empire. He parted ways there was virtually little daylight between him and Churchill in so many different elements. But when it came to the empire, he was determined that the empire at the end of the war would come to an end. And he knew that hurt Churchill, but he just felt that was the future of the world. And I think he felt the same way with the French. Now, in terms of Roosevelt's response to suffering, I'm trying to think of, I think it was Sherman. It was one of his aides who looked at him and said that he talks about winning or losing with the same impassivity. And he didn't lightly show his emotions. Where he most showed his emotions, I think more than anything else, was after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And he put his head into his hands, and the word was put out that he was as stoic as a rock, and some historians have parodied that over and over. But in fact, what happened on that day was he put his head in his hands, and he shook his head, and he said, "My God, I'm going to go down in history as a disgraced president." You, sir, back there. Oh, okay.
Is there any historical evidence that of the German reaction or analysis to the non-responsiveness of the Allies to what they were doing to the Jews?
Yes. No. There's plenty of evidence, and in fact, at one point there was a conference where America, knowing that it wasn't going to do too much in terms of helping the Jews and was unwilling, they did what all great diplomats do. They convene a conference and they pretend to be doing something. And at this conference, they talked about all sorts of things, about this, that, and the other thing. And the conference ended up deadlocked with nothing but the most cosmetic of efforts to help out the Jews. And Hitler and Himmler loved it. They made statements, and they said very forthrightly, they said, see, even their allies don't want them. So they made great hay with that. Yes, sir.
Two-part question for you. Domestically, the American mindset, the public was with this isolationism / neutrality. How was Roosevelt able to change the American mindset from isolationism to being engaged in the world affairs? And
Right.
two, what role did he have in mediating between Churchill and Stalin?
All right, just in the interest of time, because we're going to have to wrap up in about 5 minutes and a few more people want to ask something, I want to answer the first question about what did he do about anti-isolationist sentiment. Well, he increasingly forged this relationship with Churchill, and he forged the policy of Lend-Lease, which really, when it looked like Great Britain would go under financially, we came to their rescue, and we did the same with the Soviet Union. But it's a very interesting story, and what one sees with Roosevelt, that as talented and as gifted a politician as he was, and as great a communicator as he was often unwilling to get out ahead of public opinion, to shift public opinion. And there's a serious and important debate that takes place among some historians about could we or should we have gotten into the war earlier and sooner. Now, in terms of public opinion, one other thing that you could have asked is what about the fact that much of America was itself pretty much vaguely anti-Semitic, that they didn't take too kindly to Jews even during the worst parts of the final solution. And what I say to that is Roosevelt was a great leader. He is one of our 3 greatest presidents. I believe when he cared about doing something, and particularly in World War II, once it began, the American people would have followed him to the ends of the earth. He wasn't like an Abraham Lincoln, who as late as even 1864 and even into 1865, much of the nation was against him, even much of his own party. Roosevelt had the country with him, and the Jews needed a voice, they needed a champion, they needed somebody to process what was taking place with this barbarity of the final solution, and to come to their help and their rescue. And they never found that in Roosevelt for whatever reason. I'm going to take one more question, and that's it. And then we have books, I guess, if any of you want me to sign your books. Yes, sir, Ray. Yeah. Great.
Thanks, Jay. If you look at the photographs of Roosevelt in 1944, and I've not seen that many yet, but the ones I've seen, he is a sick man.
Yeah.
As you say, the ones that are most telling, the collar, separation from the neck. He goes to Bernard Baruch's estate in San Simon's Island or wherever in Georgia. Who was making the decisions in his absence? The idea he didn't have the communications we have today,
Yeah.
but you've got Admiral Leahy as Chief of Staff, Admiral King, the CNO, General Marshall, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War. Who in that inner circle would have been able, courageous enough, gutsy enough? The president's not here, here's the decision. Anyone?
Well, when he was down in South Carolina, I mean, there was either by steamer or by a light little plane, they would bring things for him to look at. Now, whether or not he looked at them is another story. At one point, he wrote around that time, he said, and this is where I said he said he would sleep 12 hours a day and just sleep and want to sleep and sleep. And then he said, and the rest of the world can go hang. And then I have a line in the book where I say, but the world didn't hang. But on the other hand, he either made his decisions or his staff just made the decisions that were an automatic pilot, or nothing was done. But largely, the overall elements were made. And what you see with Roosevelt is Roosevelt was an interesting president. He could get down into the weeds and deal with the details. He understood bureaucracy as well as anyone. And for you policy types, I mean, I love this quote. At one point he said, he said, oh, don't worry about the War Department over there, I can handle them. And at another point he said, you know, you punch the Navy Department with your right, you punch them with your left, and you keep doing that, and it ends up the same. So he understood exactly how the bureaucracy worked. Yeah, and he knew how to circumvent the bureaucracy. Now, when he was sick, was there somebody else to do that? The answer is no. But it's hard to talk about policies not made as opposed to made unless you really study it. So I don't want to talk about something that I'm not as intimately familiar with. Anyway, guys, you've been a great audience. Thank you very much for coming.